Thank you very much for coming to this, folks. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm a historian and archaeologist for NOAA for our Sanctuaries office. And I do like to talk for a living. So part one's going to be 3.5 hours, and then we'll have a little break and move right on with part 2, 3, and 4. This is a talk about one of the submarines that we've looked at underwater. And there are a number in Hawaii, and I'll talk about that at the end. But this is the one. And sometimes people ask me, you know, in your job as an archaeologist, as a historian, you get to do some fun things. What's the most exciting thing underwater? And you can never narrow it down to one thing, but of all the subs we've seen underwater, sunken subs, which is a little ironic because subs are meant to sink, right? But these are on the bottom. It's even more ironic when you're inside a submersible like that, looking at a sub underwater. This is the most impressive one by far, the Sentoku, the I-400. So this talk will be about this submarine, about the underwater investigation, and then a bit about the larger field of these types of things underwater at the end. If you're not familiar with this particular submarine, this is a Japanese submarine. This is a World War II era submarine, and it was fantastic technology at the time in ways far advanced of anything we had. And we had no idea, really, that they were building these. This was an idea from one of the really upper-ups in the Japanese Navy by Admiral Yamamoto. And as these things go, if you know about ship construction, you also know that, you know, to gear up and manufacture and build these is a years and years long process. This is something they started in the 30s, a concept that comes from the 20s, really, being able to put some attack capability on submarines. In the 30s, they're building them. But they really don't launch them until the very end of the war. So you can see 18 were proposed, only 3 were ever completed, and only 2 ever entered combat service. But this is a truly large special submarine of interesting design. It's basically 2 cylinders side by side, as you can see in these cross sections here of the hull, giving it enormous stability and incredible length. This is 400 feet long, longer than anything we had at the time. And there's this odd cylinder on the deck here. And you may know what that is already. And there's a crane on the foredeck here. And you can see something right here, right in front of the cylinder, in front of that door. And what that is in this cutaway is one of 3 attack aircraft, which were inside this watertight hangar. These are Seiran aircraft, and they were designed to be brought out of the hangar at the surface, obviously, assembled very quickly, catapulted off a launch ramp, fly a mission, scout for the fleet, or actually use their offensive capabilities of dropping bombs or torpedoes, return to the sub and be picked up by that crane and put back in the hangar. That's a pretty advanced concept because we had tried to do something like that in the 20s and failed at it. But the Japanese succeeded at that. So if you understand what it means to combine that concept with a submarine that had a range of some 37,000 miles, this could have popped up anywhere in the world, off of New York, anywhere, and launched these aircraft. Now, granted, 3 attack aircraft aren't a whole lot, but it is something. It is a capacity that no one else had at the time. So a really interesting advancement in the technology. And I want to point out just the sheer size of this thing. This is the largest submarine to date at that time ever built. And in fact is still longer than our current class of attack submarines. There's a Virginia class attack submarine, that's the USS Hawaii. And this at 400 feet is longer than the USS Hawaii. So it's kind of astounding that these things actually ever were built and were functional. This is an image of the aircraft, the Seiran aircraft, the Storm from a Clear Sky attack aircraft. These are very special as well. 550 nautical mile range, capable of carrying bombs or torpedoes, and there's only one left in the world. And if you've ever been to the Smithsonian in Washington, D.C., and gone out to the Udvar-Hazy Annex, you can see one of those. The last one left is Seiran aircraft with the pontoon floats here, so they'd land on the water and be picked up by the sub again. Very interesting design. The plan was for these submarines to make a strategic strike actually at the Panama Canal, which is amazing. You've got to think, you know, that's a pretty bold move. This was late in the war, and the war was not going well for Japan. So I wouldn't call it a desperation measure, but a bold, brazen move, you know, really forward-looking at something that would have crippled our ability to send ships and supplies through the canal between the Atlantic and the Pacific theaters. But you have to wonder, you know, would it have been enough? I don't know. And would 3 planes, 3 of these Saran bombers with their bombs on board, have been enough to actually damage one of the locks in the canal? Again, I don't know, it's a gamble. But they never did get to carry that out, because to stage that type of attack, it wouldn't have just been one submarine, and it was getting to the end of the war. They didn't have time to put that one together. So what they did put together in the last couple months were the plans for an attack on Ulithi Atoll. So by this stage in the Pacific War, the amphibious forces, the U.S. Pacific Fleet, is making its way further and further to the west, and using atolls that they've captured in island areas as staging bases, because you may know in the lagoons of atolls, it's a very peaceful area if you can get a big ship in there, protected from the weather. Ulithi Atoll was serving that function at the time. Here's a rather remarkable photograph, not taken at that time. This is earlier, because this actually shows you some aircraft carriers that by 1944 were already on the bottom of the sea, but carriers would line up in Ulithi Atoll like this. They actually called that Murderer's Row after the 1927 Yankees team. So there was quite a capacity in strike force at Ulithi, and the plan was to send the two functioning I-400 class Sentoku submarines down there to make a strike. An offensive strike against those carriers lined up, which are obviously the high priority targets. And you can see the tracks here leaving from Japan, headed south to Ulithi Atoll. 2 of the Sentokus were accompanied by 2 smaller submarines, which also could launch 2 aircraft, not 3, actually. And so they would rendezvous down near Ulithi and launch their planes. Also a bold move. Also, you have to wonder if that would have been enough. Just a handful of planes going up against a defended fleet like this, even in Anchorage. That plan also didn't come to fruition because the war ended and the emperor came on the radio and announced the end of hostilities. Fortunately, really, for both sides. August 15th, that announcement is made. The submarines turn and head back to their base in Japan, or begin to head back in that direction. On the 19th, I-400, the flagship of these 3 subs that were launched, is captured by the U.S. On the 29th, I-401, her sister ship, is captured by the U.S. And those were peaceful takeovers, so to speak. But that's an amazing moment to me. You've got to wonder about that. This is a story that I don't think anyone's ever really written up in very much detail. You can go online and you can find some of the histories about these subs, but the notes that we've put together about their capture, about the U.S. prize cruise that took them to Japan, and then took them from Japan to Hawaii, and what happened to them in the end, really it's not written up. But you've got to ask yourself, you know, what was that like for the American crew to go on board these ships and take over these vessels peacefully? Yes? Correct. Yeah, they were almost back to Japan when they were finally interceded by the U.S. ships. And the U.S. was in Japan at that time already. Our ships were there. Surrender had taken place.
How big was the crew? What size was the crew?
Oh, the crew of the...
big ship. How many men did you need to run it?
Yeah, that's a good question. 157 for the original crew, although you could put more on there if you had to, I guess. That's a lot. Yeah. So for the Americans to go on board and, you know, meet their counterparts after having fought this war and sail with them back to Japan would have been a really interesting time. I'm sure there are a number of stories that come out of that. One of the stories, the alleged stories, is kind of strange. The commander who was given charge of the attack on Ulithi was Captain Izumi. And so he was on board the I-400, I believe. And I'm sorry, the I-401. And he apparently had also committed a number of atrocities in the Indian Ocean. Bad things happen on every side during every war. So, you know, no one's pointing fingers anymore, but he had a guilty conscience, apparently. He committed suicide in his cabin on board the submarine after the Americans were on board. And the crew, his crew, was able to bury him over the side into the sea. And the American officers knew nothing about it. Completely secret. So if it did happen that way, that's really one of those odd moments. And we're finding more images of this. It's hard to find the sailors anymore. There are not a lot of them left anymore to talk about their experiences, but we did have a chance to interview some of the prize crews that did go on board and then bring these subs back to Hawaii, and they have some great stories to tell. But images like this are really striking. It's this peaceful capture, and then the Japanese engineers and sailors showing the Americans how to operate this super secret sub that they almost used in this last-ditch attack. There's got to be a mixture of, you know, a remnant of hatred and anger after this terrible war, but then relief that it's over, and maybe somewhere even empathy or respect for what the soldiers did on each side. I don't know. That's really complex. This is a forward torpedo room, the upper forward torpedo room. You can see 4 tubes there. These large subs had 8 tubes in their bows, an upper torpedo room and a lower torpedo room. Just immense. So after being in Japan, they were brought back with American crews on board under American flag to Hawaii. Our allies, the Russians, at the time when they were in Japan, were very interested in looking at this technology. And this is also kind of a Cold War story. We were not so interested in sharing this with the Russians and didn't allow them on board and brought them back to Pearl Harbor, where the request continued by the Russians to come and share in this technological achievement of, you know, this vanquished enemy. Here in Pearl Harbor, you can see the I-400 and the I-401, and in between the I-14, a smaller class of sub, but also with the watertight hangar and that big door right here on the deck for launching aircraft. And there was pretty high interest in these things. These were immense, and we had no idea that they had these, and they were really advanced beyond anything that we could have built at the time. So there was a lot of interest, and there must have been a lot of pressure from the Soviet Union and memos between State Departments going back and forth like that. The easy solution to the problem was to finish our examination and then take them offshore and sink them. And that's exactly what we did. And we happen to have images of this. And in my field, I guess we don't often get to see the exact moment when ships go down all the time, but here's the I-400 being used in torpedo practice, in a sinking target practice. And you can see the torpedoes ranging it on the bow, striking the bow, and this explosion actually setting off one here a little early, and the thing goes down offshore of Barber's Point out in Deepwater. And there's never any expectation, again, that anyone would be interested in looking at that stuff or finding it on the bottom, certainly. So the way that they recorded positions was pretty rough back then when they got rid of these things. This is an intentional disposal, not an accidental shipwreck site, and she's kind of lost to history. All of the subs that were taken out there. Now, as it goes, though, there ends up being interest in the historical side of it, the story of this attack, and one of the things that the University of Hawaii's Undersea Research Lab has really excelled at is looking at some of the existing data, in this case, some multi-beam data. You can see the contours of the seafloor out here, and multi-beam and backscatter data. This is just acoustical data. Sound data transferred, converted over to a visual image, and they're picking up a little odd target right here on the sea floor, several miles offshore. That doesn't look quite natural for the surrounding terrain. And there's some interest in that. And Terry Kirby and Stephen Price and Chris Kelly, who work for Hawaii Embassy Research Lab, HURL, have done the best job in looking at data like this and finding these types of targets. Now these guys, they're fantastic guys. Every year they have to kind of get their subs in shape for training missions. They do practice dives. So if they have a target like this, they'll actually do some practice dives on it. And that way it saves us money, saves them money, and they have interest in history. They've got to look at these things. Now in this case, our office funded this dive though. We have an office in NOAA called the Office of Exploration and Research, OER. We have nothing but acronyms in NOAA. And there's going to be a test on these after my talk. And so OER funded this because there was a lot of interest internationally in this type of sub, this I-400. So we developed some archaeological objectives, some of the things we could answer. How fast is it falling apart? What can the wreck site tell us about what happened to it on the way down? That kind of thing. Is it a biological reef now for deep sea communities? Of course it is. We wrote up a grant for OER. They funded a series of dives. And we were off with Terry Kirby in the Pisces 5. University of Hawaii has two of these submersibles, Pisces 4 and Pisces 5. This is the 5. And in the past, they've put both subs on one ship, and they'll dive both subs at the same time. But in a little more economical fashion, you can also put one sub on this barge. This is a floating barge that you can submerge, a submersible barge. You can take the barge out there and have the divers sink the barge down and deploy off this barge, kind of lift off of it, go do the mission, come back, have the barge take you back up. So it's like half the cost, which is nice. So that's what we did. Jim Delgado, Terry, and myself, getting, a chance to look for the I-400 and hoping to be very lucky in time find it. And in fact, that target turned out to be the I-400. Very lucky. Here's how it shows up on the sonar screen when you're on the bottom inside the command sphere. We have a nice sonar target there in front of us to the left, but it's only about 360 feet long. And we're looking for a 400-foot submarine, so we're not sure this is the I-400. And then we land on the deck, and all of this superstructure, the conning tower, the big hangar, gone, gone, gone. It's just a debris, just wreckage and debris on deck. And here you can see the beginning of that launch ramp right there. So all of this stuff came off on the way down. There's the ramp itself. And there are a couple small ramps here. Those are for the pontoons. So the big hangar door would open, the plane would come out. They had a couple little tubes down here that bring the pontoons out, put the whole plane together. This looks like a bear rug. That's what we called it. Who left the bear rug on the submarine at 500 meters under the water? It's not a bear rug. We looked at it pretty closely. I believe it's cyanobacteria. It's probably carcass fall. It's probably a dolphin, sorry to say, or something like that, decomposing underwater over time. Nobody lost their life on this sub, so we're kind of like, no, that's not human remains. Exactly like a bear rug. But what started to really tell us this is the I-400 and not a smaller class or different submarine was when we got up off the bow, we realized something bad happened to the bow. The bow fell off. That can't be good. That's not supposed to happen. The thing probably impacted bow first into the bottom. So that gave us the ability to look directly into the torpedo tubes. Here's the bow, and here are the torpedo tube doors, and the tubes are actually back here. These are the ends of the tubes right back here. And here in the upper part we have 4, and here below that, here's the upper part, below that we have 4 more, we have 8, and there's no other submarine that has 8 bow tubes. So we believe it's the I-400. The deck gun was a match on the stern. Lots of submarines, usually all of them had, a deck gun they could use at the surface and save their torpedoes if they could. This one was the same. 140 millimeter standard type deck gun on these Japanese large submarines. Here it is, covered by a piece of metal shroud. Just the force of water on or impact on the bottom on the way down just melted that metal shroud. Looked like kind of cloth that was all curved and pushed and contoured to the breech of the gun itself. And there's where it is on the submarine. And then the stern light, the stanchion is posterior for the stern light, and the rudders, the large rudders you can see on the bottom, match some of the historical photos of the I-400 when it was out of the water at one time. Very similar. You can see part of the hull is crushed here, kind of imploded inwards. These were taken out and prepared for sinking, so the crews should have opened up all the watertight doors. In this case, something was closed in the aft end, and there was a sealed compartment on its way down. It just imploded and pulled the hull in. Yes?
Was there a reason that they decided to sink it rather than scrap it? Or for scrapping it, you think that they do that over time?
Yeah, that's been a lot of high-quality steel. Part of the story we don't know. You know, what was the pressure from the State Department for the Navy to do that, or was there? Did the Russians really think they had a chance of coming over and getting on those subs in Pearl Harbor? Not likely in 1945. Good question. No idea. But we've used as target assets a lot of old ships, actually. And I'm not sure why the call has been made. We have someone here who's a good friend of mine, Don Froning, Colonel Froning, may know of that. In fact, Don's giving the talk next week, correct?
Yes, same time.
Yeah, he'll be here on the TPY stuff. Look forward to that. But yeah, that call of why wouldn't you scrap all these instead of use them as target assets? I don't know.
I think one thing to really note, post World War II, there were a lot of things, not just these submarines, but several vessels and also landing craft and other things were simply just dumped off the South Shore in deeper water. Again, with the idea, no one will ever. It's so deep, no one will ever look at it again. But even in the 30s, some of the last of the certain types of commercial steamships in Hawaii were also systematically dumped in the same area. So again, a good question: why wouldn't they maybe try and scrap?
We couldn't scrap them here, right? We didn't have the facilities to scrap them here.
Yeah, true. Yeah.
They're going to Washington State, which is a long tow.
So it's probably a more convenient.
And what if the Russians intercepted the tow?
Yeah.
I don't know. Boris, I don't mean to say anything bad about our friends. This is why we were so interested in making a positive identification, though, because the I-23, which is out there somewhere, another Japanese submarine, is about the length of what we saw in sonar. And the I-23 was a submarine that was sent over in February 1942 because Pearl Harbor was almost sort of attacked, if you remember. After Pearl Harbor, there were a couple seaplanes that made a very bold voyage, refueled at French frigate shoals, came down to Pearl Harbor to scout for the aircraft carriers to see where they were. This is prior to Midway, prior to the Battle of Midway. And weather was bad. They kind of dropped their few bombs on the hills behind Roosevelt High School and up on Tantalus and flew away. But the I-23 was stationed here in case those Japanese seaplanes had to ditch off of Oahu. Something happened to the I-23, and the Japanese Navy never heard from that boat again. So the I-23 is a combat loss with her entire crew. So if we did find the I-23, that would be an immediate communication to the consulate of Japan and the Japanese government. It's very sensitive, which is why we wanted to make sure we weren't looking at the I-23. And we really didn't think we were at that time. But the discovery of the I-400 elucidated enough interest in Japan that NHK, the Japanese broadcasting company, funded a series of dives to go back and do the rest of the survey. We had enough time on our dive to look at the main hull, but all of the stuff that came off the top we never found. And it's funny, I hate to say it again, but there you are, low on air, weather's going bad, last 5 minutes of the dive, you make the discovery. Sometimes it's like that. We found the main hull, but didn't find the rest of the really interesting parts because the significance is this ability to launch those planes. So NHK came out, funded the dives. This time they put both subs on the ship, and we head back out to do a series of dives on the I-400. We're very lucky to participate with Hurl and NHK on this. And I apologize for some of these pictures. When I'm on the observer's seat, on the left or right, there'll be some part of the manipulator in some of these pictures on the Pisces sub. But you may be able to make out on the lower hull down here, this is where the bow impact damage was from the torpedo. And we didn't know what this long tube was for a long time until we realized it rolled off at the top. That's just one of the chambers they shoved the pontoons into, so they could drag the pontoon out of. It had its own watertight chamber. Now we're back at the stern looking at the dive planes and the twin propellers, right? So the rudder, dive planes, and all of this cabling. This is, we would imagine this is probably degaussing cable, which a lot of Navy ships had, kind of wrapping their sides. Big steel ships have a big magnetic signature, so one thing you can do to them is using electrical charges and cables like this, reverse that magnetic signature, make them harder to detect. And we believe that this was some of the permanent degaussing cable that came off the exterior of the hull. And then a debris field. We began to pick up a debris field away from the main hull and want to follow that trail to the bigger interesting pieces. And here's one of them. This watertight hangar had a really large, heavy door. Here it is, this big triangular shaped thing swung partially open. And in this case, there's the hinge, and the point is going right down into the sand, so we're looking at the inside of the door and the hinge. And we figured the hangar's got to be around there somewhere. But this hangar is so big, if we found it, the Pisces sub could have driven right into it. That's a pretty large hangar. Pretty amazing. There it is, relatively close by. It's been damaged quite a bit too. Here's the portion that was attached to the submarine, and it must have just blown off on its way down. I couldn't really tell from those photographs on the surface if the door was open or closed when they sank this, but I guess the speed of this thing headed to the bottom just kind of ripped all this stuff off after the torpedo impacts. Then we were amazed to see these, the periscopes themselves, completely unbent and undamaged and shiny and silver on the bottom, which led us to the bridge. So now we're looking at the conning tower and the bridge. There are the periscopes sticking up, right there. And we're beginning to look at the bridge itself here with all of the accoutrement of stations for binoculars and range finders and the equipment you bring out on the bridge to navigate and to plot targets. There are all the details in here. And there's kind of a close-up. And you can see one of the lookout stands here. It's a stand and then the kind of the ring, and someone would stand up inside that ring up here on the periscopes. They would man lookouts for aircraft, of course, every time they were on the surface. And here are the pedestals and access hatches down into the pressure hull, which is, of course, gone. The whole bridge is laying over on its side and quite a ways away from the rest of the submarine. And you can see the rusticles dripping off this as well. The way these steel shipwrecks begin to melt back into their environment. The rusticles are something that people focused on with Titanic quite a bit. Thought, oh, look at all that rust. Well, it's actually, they're microbes. There are several species of microbes that eat the sulfides in the metal and exist in very low oxygen environments and produce that corrosion in ropes, and it just drips off like icicles, hence the term rusticles. Then we're also lucky to find all three anti-aircraft guns. And in this case, we're looking at triple mount 25 millimeter anti-aircraft guns. You can see them here on the hangar. There's one, and there's one. And here's a machine gun higher up. And these are kind of upside down. I guess the heaviest part were the barrels. So you have the 3 barrels sticking into the sand here. And the same thing here. So we found the door, the hangar, the conning tower and bridge, and these 3 anti-aircraft mounts, which is most of the superstructure, and filmed it all for the Japanese special, their documentary, which they put together. So we're feeling pretty good about that. But this is an amazing picture because for all the things I've shown you and what folks here at the Hanauma Bay Education Center have done that's exactly appropriate is made a cartoon of a small submersible with a little light in a big dark cave. That's what it's like to find these things underwater. It's like being in a huge cave with a very small pen light, looking at one thing at a time. You'll never see the whole thing at once. It's not humanly possible. It's pitch black. I don't know how many volts it would take to light up a scene like that. But Terry Kirby, who is the senior pilot and operations director for Hurl, sees it in his mind and is also an artist. And so he does these fantastic paintings of his conception of the main hull, right? Stern planes, relatively undamaged, all the superstructure gone. Here's the stern gun, and there's the broken bow with the bow tubes, and there's the ramp that breaks off and hangs down over the side. And here's the Pacific communications cable that lies over the submarine. Which is another reason why we would like to know where these things are, because there will be development of projects offshore. You know, there have been proposed wind farms and things, and there will be the need for submarine cables. And if there is something historically significant, we'd just rather not see it draped over a target like this. But yeah, they didn't have any idea this was there at that time, obviously. That's an amazing picture. You know, congratulations to Terry for providing these. And I think someday when he retires, if ever, and I hope it's not soon, that he puts on an art exhibit, because you'd be amazed at the things he sees, not just the shipwrecks, but underwater volcanoes and all the things he's seen underwater in his years of work with Hurl. So I have been asked, well, you know, that's an interesting sub, but how many submarines are out there? And this is probably the bulk of the list that we know about anyway, the reported losses. You can see we have a fair number of Japanese submarines. The Kohoteki are the midget subs, the mini subs, the 2-man submersibles, which was a really big discovery in 2002 for Hurl, with the one sunk by the Ward right outside Pearl Harbor, and is the topic for another talk sometime. We still have 3 here in the islands. That's why I'm not listing all 5, because 2 have been taken to other places. But we have the 2 large I-400 class subs. We have a faster attack sub, the I-201, very advanced, very futuristic. The deck gun retracted. It was covered with kind of a rubberized coating to reduce the acoustic signature. Very advanced, very fast underwater. The I-23 I mentioned, the I-203, and then we have American submarines, all of these. Now, most of these subs, the very early ones, the F-class and the S-1 classes here, we're talking about 1920s era. And the rest, most of these are all intentional disposals. You know, we're done with it, it's going to be scrapped, or we're going to get rid of it, take it out as a target exercise. The S-28 is not an intentional disposal. I'll just point that one out here. That is an S-1 class boat. These were launched in the 20s. They were still in service when World War II started, but they were not large enough, frankly, they're very uncomfortable. They weren't our frontline attack subs. They weren't like the Bowfin submarine. They weren't like the Gato and Palau class submarines that come later. So they were used in coastal defense and in reconnaissance. But it was pretty difficult service. They were called big boats. But this one, in this case, during the war, was used for training locally. And crews would go out on that boat, S-28, with a Coast Guard escort and practice, you know, ranging in and firing a dummy torpedo. Something bad happened off of Barber's Point. The Coast Guard escort Reliance lost contact with the S-28. A couple days later, a big oil slick comes up. That's all we know about. It would really be nice to know what happened to the S-28. In fact, it would give closure to some of those families because there are 49 sailors on board that boat. Questions about this list? It's all going to be on the test. The S-19, which is just like the S-28, these are both early S-1 class 1920s submarines, we actually had a chance to take a look at just the other day, Thursday. NOAA has a vessel called the Okeanos Explorer. The Okeanos Explorer is here in Pearl Harbor for the next few years and does deep underwater science with an ROV, a remotely operated system. So whereas Terry has manned submersibles, untethered, ranging free, like real explorers should, ROVs are robots on an umbilical, and they're deployed by the ship. And I think both systems have different capacities. And in our field, there's a little bit of a debate going on about, should we get rid of the manned submersibles? Do they do things that ROVs can't? Are ROVs better? Are they cheaper? It's not unlike NASA. It's not unlike talking about manned or unmanned space exploration, except NASA's budget's a lot bigger. But actually last Thursday, I had a chance to go out on the Okeanos and look at the S-19, which was really interesting. There are a number of exotic corals on that sub, and Frank Parrish had put a data logger on that sub, so he had to go back and collect it. And they said, Hans, you're an archaeologist, so come on out and you can do the survey. The S-19 was sunk intentionally as well, so it's not a story there of a combat loss or anything. It was wonderful doing the survey. It's a topic for another talk. That survey is available online if you go to OSHA, Office for Exploration and Research, NOAA OER. You'll find that data and video available. But the one thing I noticed about this ROV system, not to take anything off of what Terry does, because manned submersibles can do things that a robot on a string can't. They have to be really careful with entanglements, for instance, and the weight of the cable itself to that ROV is a real issue. But Terry's operating off batteries, and those batteries power the life support and the thrusters and everything. So when he turns his lights on, he's like, are we done? I'm turning the light off. His lights are this powerful. The ROV that we use for the S-19 survey is on an umbilical power cord with 27,000 volts. So when they turn those lights on, I've never seen anything lit up like that before in my life. That was really great. That's a topic for another talk. Anyway, that's the known list for some of these other submarines that are out there. And there are some real interesting targets we'd like to get to. Not just ones that were intentionally put down, but a serious loss that is a mystery. Question?
When the Sentoku were given up peacefully,
Yes.
were they running on the surface? Who communicated to them that they were to give up peacefully?
That's an excellent question. We believe, because the story has not been written. I don't know where all those records are, but we think it'll be a matter of the command, the Japanese Imperial Navy Command, instructing their sub-commanders, return to base, jettison your torpedoes. That's exactly what they did. They weren't handing that stuff over if they didn't have to. Fired off all the torpedoes, shot off all the planes, got rid of the planes. And part of that interesting story is, before they were going to launch the attack on Ulithi Atoll, the commander of that force instructed the engineers to paint those planes in American colors. And that made the pilots very angry because that was completely dishonorable. It was thought to confuse the carriers at Ulithi, and they wouldn't, right? I mean, you can see why they do it, but you can't be doing that. You can't do things like that and not be.
My uncle was on a sub, and their tail end for it was some manure Americans, so it's the skipper, the runner, and the
Yeah.
bottom.
Oh, yeah.
And they were in the Caribbean, and they were sunk by us. They were
Oh, mistaken, yeah. Friendly fire?
sunk by friendly fire.
Yeah, that's terrible. It does happen. Right. Right. So they would have been instructed, I think, to, remain at the surface, fly a flag, obey all instructions if a Navy ship comes by. Yeah. Oh, I see. Yeah. No, I'm sure these subs would have stayed at the surface after the war's over. I'm glad that was handled peacefully, though. Other questions? Yes?
You said U.S. tried to stop failed when they tried to do the Sentoku kind of.
Yes.
So did they study the Sentoku before they?
No, they had no idea. But much earlier in the 1920s, in fact, the S-1 submarine that I was talking about, this S-19, the S-4, that class, that was launched in 1920. So it's a design that comes from around 1915, 1916, right? It's actually all in response to World War I. When we saw what the Germans did with the submarine wolf packs in World War I in the Atlantic, and realized they actually had a chance of bringing England to her knees by sinking merchantmen left and right, we thought, we better get in the game. So the S-1 class for us is our first ocean-going attack submarine that we ever built. It's not as fast as the German subs in World War II. It didn't have the range, but it's about the same size as a German U-boat in World War II, a German Type 7. So that was our first commitment to have an ocean-going open fleet. But in 1920, we had no idea what the Japanese were going to do with their designs. And we weren't the only Navy that were looking at that kind of thing too. The British Navy was also experimenting with submarines that could launch an aircraft, right? But again, no one was successful at this except for the Japanese Navy to that point. Yeah, that's interesting. I don't know about the Germans, if they ever experimented with that. I don't know. That's a good question. I mean, I imagine those discussions happened. If you see other navies doing this, you want to not be left behind.
Just changing the topic slightly.
Mm-hmm.
Do you know where all these submarines are?
We know where all of those are. We don't know where those two are. We know the F4, S4, S19, and bluegill. And all of these we have a general area, but they haven't been discovered yet. And of course, the S-28, we have a general area, hasn't been discovered yet. The S-28 is beyond the range of the Pisces submersibles. So it's not something I could try to talk my friend Terry into at Hurl, even if I did have the budget to pay him for his time. So I'm trying to talk the Okeanos Explorer into spending more time in that survey area. They've got one more leg in their current project where they're running up to the northwestern Hawaiian Islands. So every time they go past that area, out past Barber's Point, they're switching on their multi-beam and trying to pick up a target for S-28. If they have a target that's worthwhile to look at, we think it's not a glitch or an anomaly, then I want to talk them into at least having half a day and splashing the robot in. That would really be a significant discovery. Right, right. Couple more. So the submarines, of course, are only part of our inventory. Here's a list of known wreck sites in Hawaii. I don't know that Hawaii gets its fair share or recognition for being a place that has a lot of wrecks, but there certainly are a lot. They're not in good shape often because we're a very high energy environment. And most of the wrecks that divers come here to dive are artificial reefs, so they're kind of put down on the bottom intentionally. But we do have a lot of stuff from the war period. Landing craft and aircraft. Don's talk next week will be about one of those aircraft in Kaneohe Bay, which is a casualty of the December 7th attack. And if you're interested in this type of information, I'll just let you know that we do have an annual conference we put on. It's actually, we're proud to say, its 27th year. Every February, every President's Day weekend, as a collaborative effort between NOAA and a local nonprofit organization, MAHI, and University of Hawaii Marine Option Program, we just have a couple days of talks during the weekend of locals, very informal, historians, archaeologists, interested folks, divers, and we deal with all kinds of topics of maritime history, the Pacific, Hawaii, and shipwrecks and underwater discoveries. If you'd like to be on that list, just let me know, hans.vantilburg@noaa.gov. You can always reach me through the Education Center here. It's a really fun conference, and there's food, and a field trip, and a banquet, a barbecue. Yeah, you got to have a barbecue. So this is the last slide. I just want to say, it's a wonderful story. It's a part of history, this I-400 class. It's surrender, its examination, and its rediscovery. But I always have to ask myself, and you should too, when you see these kinds of talks, well, what have we learned? Because maritime archaeology is more than just, we found this thing and we had a really good dive and here are some pictures. It's fun. But what do we really learn? What have we come away with? What's new? And so as interesting as the story is, this is a historical story. It hasn't been written. So the contribution of the site is to that historical narrative. to those stories, because that generation is almost not with us anymore. So there are important stories there to tell. It's not so much the archaeology of this site. I would not say this site is a high priority archaeology site. I mean, we have a lot of photographs of these things. The examination the Navy did was written up, and it's somewhere. We haven't found that file yet, but it's somewhere, I imagine. And frankly, all of the personal effects and the cargo and the weapons, et cetera, are not on that sub. It was stripped. Those are the things that would have told us about life on board that submarine. So this is not a high priority archaeology site. It's a history site. And also I would say it's one that, when you see the images from the past, you see things like what they flew on the conning tower, you can understand the feelings at that time after World War II are not the feelings we have anymore. As I point this out, and in talks like this, especially to students, about reconciliation. You know, we can go to these sites and we can share these discoveries with Japan and with America, and look back on ways that we behaved and felt that are now in the past. Now, we shouldn't lose sight of the importance of reconciliation. Then I say, can you imagine anyone looking at all of the artifacts and debris left over from current wars, and when we ever get to the point in the future where we could do that with some of the people that we're fighting today? I don't know, but at least there's hope. Yeah.
I was amazed when the movie that has been produced for Pearl Harbor visitors actually admitted that we drew first blood, that we
Yeah.
sang that with in Pearl Harbor before the attack happened.
Sure.
And that amazed me, that they frankly just say it, and it's like, well, then why the heck didn't you know that you were under attack? Because many said they come from anywhere but other.
Yeah. Yeah, you're right. I like to see that. Yeah, it's
They
true.
do say it. They
Yeah.
say it right up.
Yeah.
Well, because for them did shoot around really heavy on the desk.
Mhm.
But once Ballard found it on the floor of public, and it's millions of tons of debris that are out there, there's a whole like through the common Ballard.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah. Terry found it. Terry finds everything. Yes.
So ISIS is from NOAA.
You can hit the lights on. Pisces Sub was begun as a National Undersea Research Center funded by NOAA with the University of Hawaii. So that's the origin of the Pisces Sub program. Now, unfortunately, in recent years, NOAA has drawn back and cut that budget for Pisces. So now they're reliant on just UH, which makes it difficult to maintain that manned undersea program, which is a really wonderful program. There are only very few types of programs like that in the world. And, this is a real efficient one we have here in the UH. I think that's why there's this interesting discussion, this question of, ROVs versus manned submersibles, are they worth it? I believe that those manned subs can do things that ROVs can't. And I don't know that launching an entire Okeanos Explorer is necessarily any cheaper than putting manned submersibles in the water. But I think both systems have different capacities special to each type of operation. I think they're both worthwhile. That's a good question. Yeah, my last point is about reconciliation. That's what I would emphasize. After 60 years, there's no more animosity. I hope that gives me hope for the things we're doing now in the future. Thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed this talk. And yeah, any other questions?
Who found Titanic?
Bob Ballard.
Terry didn't find that.
Bob Ballard. Robert Ballard.